Happy New Year, powerful people. Today is Job Numbers Day, and welcome to this Workers by the Numbers blogcast presented by the Power at Work blog. I'm Alicia Modestino, a professor of economics and public policy at Northeastern University, and the executive director of Community to Community, a new initiative to promote the use of community engaged research to make social change. Today, we're going to talk about the latest jobs report, which was released by the Bureau of Labor Statistics just this morning. Joining me today is our panel of expert labor economists who regularly analyze these numbers every month and offer their insights to advise policymakers, practitioners, and workers about the labor market. First, newcomer Dr. Kate Bond, Director of Research of WorkRise, a research to action network hosted by the Urban Institute. Before joining Urban, she was a chief economist and the Director of Labor Market Policy at the Washington Center for Equitable Growth. Welcome, Kate.
Thank you so much for having me, Alicia.
And second, returning guest and my dear friend, Dr. Harry Holzer, who is the John Lafarge Jr. Professor of Public Policy at Georgetown University's McCourt School of Public Policy and former Chief Economist for the U.S. Department of Labor. Welcome, Harry. Good to see you again.
Thank you, Alicia. Nice to see you.
Excellent. All right. So as they say, let's do the numbers. Remember, the household survey data seasonal adjustment factors have been revised back to January 2019, so some trends might look a little different here, but here are the headline numbers from today's employment situation report. The economy created 216,000 jobs in December, which was above the 170,000 that economists were expecting, and certainly stronger than October and November, which were both revised down to 105 and 173,000 respectively. Over the entire year, payroll employment was 2.7 million in 2023. What recession? For an average monthly gain of 225,000. Now, this is less than the increase of 4.8 million that we saw in 2022, when the average monthly gain was 399,000. But the key takeaway here is that employment's high, above pre-pandemic levels, still growing at a strong rate, but it's slowing or normalizing as supply and demand come back into balance. In terms of industries, employment continues to increase in government, healthcare, social assistance, and construction. In contrast, transportation and warehousing lost jobs. During 2023, the government added an average of 56,000 jobs per month, which was more than double the average monthly gain of 23,000 in 2022. We can thank probably the American Rescue Plan Act dollars making their way finally through the pipeline into actual spending. And healthcare also showed strong growth this year. In terms of the unemployment rate was unchanged at 3.7% in December, although this is a tad higher than December of 2023 when it was 3.5%. It's still near its 50-year low by historical standards. Plus, weekly jobless claims have been trending down over the last few months, with the number of Americans filing new claims for jobless benefits dropping to a 2-month low last week, possibly indicating a reluctance on the part of employers to cut payrolls. Labor force participation was 62.5% in December. The employment to population ratio, which is the number of people who are employed relative to the number of people in the population, was 60.1%. Both of these decreased slightly by 0.3 percentage points last month, but they showed kind of little or no change, at least over the year. In terms of earnings, average hourly earnings rose by 15 cents in December, or about 0.4%. What does that actually mean to the world? Over the past 12 months, average hourly earnings have increased by 4.1%. We don't have December's inflation numbers yet. That'll come out January 11th. But some nowcast data from the Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland is forecasting an annualized, at least core inflation rate of 3.9%, which is still above the Fed's target. But it means basically that at least workers are keeping up with the pace of inflation. And in terms of job openings themselves, openings fell 62,000 to 8.8 million. It's a 3-year low as of November, according to the Job Openings and Labor Market Turnover Survey released on Wednesday. Quits and layoffs also declined as the labor market continues to cool gradually. Okay, so let's turn to our experts. What does all this mean, all these statistics? Kate, I'm going to start with you. Are this month's numbers good for workers, bad for workers, or are they a mixed bag?
Thanks. The way I'm thinking about it is pretty good. That's sort of the term I'm using in my head because we're continuing to add jobs across a lot of sectors, particularly some strong growth in sectors that employ low-wage workers and can provide some pathways to upward mobility. And as you noted, unemployment is low and at pre-pandemic levels for workers. So I think the reason I think this is mostly good for workers is because I think it reflects a successful soft landing. You noted that job growth was above expectations. But overall, I think it reflects that the labor market is not causing inflation and the Federal Reserve doesn't need to keep increasing interest rates, perhaps could even consider cutting interest rates. But it's still possible to nitpick. I think there's some drawbacks of the current labor market that are really long-standing issues and not a reflection of whether the labor market is healthy. And so when we're thinking about factors like when you talked about labor force participation rates edging up, it's a little bit concerning. It's really getting back to where we were pre-pandemic, which was a very long and lackluster expansion. We are still much lower than the levels we were at prior to the Great Recession. We've never fully recovered from the Great Recession. And so while we've had so much improvement in such a short period of time, I think the cooling means we're going back to a labor market that was still somewhat imperfect.
That's a really good way, I think, of putting it, where, a lot of the latest news reports these days are showing economists are jumping up and down, soft landing on the way. And consumers and workers are like, really? Because it just doesn't feel that great to them. Harry, what do you think? Good for workers, bad for workers, or a mixed bag?
Well, overall, pretty good for workers. I would agree with Kate on that. What we have often talked about on previous podcasts is trying to have a Goldilocks labor market, not too hot, not too cool, just right. You don't want it too cool because then workers don't benefit from high employment levels and wage growth. You don't want it too hot because then the Federal Reserve jumps in and could keep raising interest rates. And I read this report as being maybe a tad warmer than Goldilocks would really prefer. The payroll growth number at 216, as you said, was a bit above expectations, but really not far off from the annual average over the course of 2023. I think a little more cooling might be more calming, more soothing for the Fed. The wage growth number for this month was really quite high. That 15-cent bump averages to well over 5% on an annualized basis. And over the last 2 months, it averages 4.6, 4.7. That's higher than the Fed would like to see, and probably higher than is consistent with their inflation goals. Even though over the year, as you indicated, at 4%, I think is certainly manageable. So that's a number to keep our eye on. We want wage growth above inflation. We want workers to enjoy real wage growth. But we don't want so much that the Fed gets nervous and reverses. And right now they've put interest rate increases on hold. The other number, and again, you mentioned this already, the drop of 0.3 of a percentage point of labor force participation, that worried me a bit because I think we've had nice bump ups in labor force participation. And in earlier months, over the course of the past year, we had a 0.5 of a point bump up. Higher labor force participation is a good thing because it brings workers in from the sidelines. It eliminates inflationary pressure when employers are creating a lot of jobs. So this drop down eliminated a fair amount of that bump up. Now, we don't know if it'll last. And maybe it's a quirky thing. Maybe it had something to do with the funny way in which we do seasonal adjustments. We expect labor force to bump way up in December. So if it bumped up a little less than expected, maybe that's what's going on. But the combination of high wage growth and lower participation just concerned me a little bit. But let's see what that's going to look like as we get into the new year.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Are there any particular groups that you're worried about at this point?
The participation drop off was pretty widespread. Saw it among blacks as well as whites. You saw it among men as well as women, which then leads me to believe that maybe it's some kind of funny statistical fluke of affecting all these groups. That's my hope, that it's not a lasting drop in labor force activity.
That's a really good point, especially like December is always this look back, right, over the year. It's when BLS does their seasonal adjustment. It's a little bit of a funny time to be hanging your hat on one report, right? So that's a really great point to make. I think also, in my view, I agree. Goldilocks was actually the word I wrote down too. It's not too hot. It's not too cold. It's a cooling labor market. And that said, I do feel like workers are feeling that shift in the labor market, having come off of a strong sort of white hot labor market in 2022. And so when you look at the data from the job openings and labor turnover survey, the number of people quitting their jobs is dropping, right? And it's at the lowest level since February of 2021. So labor conditions are still fairly strong. There's still, at least 1 or 1.4 job openings for every unemployed person, but not as strong as they were. So on the one hand, it could be that fewer people are job hopping. That could mean people were able to move up the job ladder. They were able to find better matches in terms of skills or working conditions or wages. On the other hand, it also feels like maybe people are seeing fewer opportunities to move to, and they don't want to get caught without a chair, since the music is certainly slowing down, even if we're not going to see it stop abruptly like in a recession. So I think that's one reason, again, why there's this disconnect between what economists see as a great labor market or like a strong economy, what consumers are feeling, is that there's also this unevenness across sectors, right? So some industries that surged during the pandemic have since shed jobs, such as those that were dependent on consumers buying physical goods. So for example, transportation and warehousing reached a peak in October 2022, but has decreased by about 100,000. Retail trade employment didn't change very much in December. So what you were saying before, we usually expect a bump up in December for retail trade, and that didn't really happen despite a strong holiday shopping season. And there were actually job losses in department stores in December of about 13,000. And again, like retail trade, recovered early in 2022, but hasn't really shown that much change since then. And then there were other sectors that struggled to win their workers back initially, like hotels and restaurants, that later, picked up to absorb workers and keep unemployment in check. So, for example, employment in leisure and hospitality didn't change a lot in December, and it's still about 1% below its pre-pandemic level. But they did add, an average of 39,000 jobs per month in 2023. So other industries that we're seeing that haven't quite recovered yet are things like childcare. Employment's still down about 20,000 workers. So it's just this very unevenness in the economy. It really depends, I think, where you are and what's happening now, or, what have you done for me lately in terms of the labor market, in terms of how people are feeling about it.
Yeah.
Okay. So, yeah, go ahead. Jump in, Kate.
I keep pointing to the research that I think a lot of people cite a lot by David Otter, Aaron Dubé, and Annie McGrew on wage convergence that finds the past 3 years have undone 40% of the rise in wage inequality since 1980, which is, I don't think we've ever seen wage convergence so rapid in American economic history. So that's incredible, but that's to say we still have really high levels of inequality. And a lot of those gains came from job search and people changing jobs. So as you note, as those openings are coming down a little bit, as people are switching jobs a little bit less, where are those gains going to come from? And so I think that's what people are still feeling, is that we still are really in an unequal labor market. And we made some progress in the past 3 years, but that we still have such an unequal labor market.
That's a good point. Aside from some really key collective bargaining agreements that have been won over the last year, we haven't really institutionalized better wages or better working conditions. It's been things, right? People have won in the sort of take this job and shove it part of the recovery, where they got to move on to something better, but it's not necessarily like we've raised job quality across the board in a way that will be stable, going forward. Mm-hmm. So let's go beyond the headline numbers. There's already been a lot of chatter this morning. I've been all over Twitter seeing what everyone is saying. But let's hear what you guys think is kind of your stat of the day, or something that you're looking, for greater insight here. So Harry, I'm going to start with you this time. What's your stat of the day, or the thing you're looking under the hood to keep track of?
I was pleased to see that the unemployment rate among African Americans dropped quite substantially, but from 5.8 to 5.2%. Now, Kate had cautioned me that that's not technically a statistically significant drop, although my guess is that it probably is significant. It's slightly higher than usual confidence levels. And those numbers, African Americans in any one month, it's a small sample. The numbers bump up and down a lot. But that particular statistic looked good to me. And similar to that, the unemployment rate for high school dropouts also dropped 0.3 of a point from 6.3 to 6%. High school dropouts always have the highest unemployment rate in the economy when those folks are in the labor force. 6% for them is a good number. So that even if these numbers bounce around somewhat, that gives me some hope that for the groups who need it the most, the labor market continues to function well and maybe be improving a little bit.
Yeah, even, looking back over the year, if you look at the gap between whites and blacks in terms of unemployment rates, that surprisingly narrowed during 2023. Again, probably not statistically significant, but it's still going in the right direction. And, it's probably something that's being felt. So, and hard to measure and see what's under there. But again, so not even just a 1 month thing, but over the entire year, looks like some ground maybe was made by more vulnerable groups. Kate, what's your stat of the day?
If I can give you two, I'm going to give you two. And one is looking
of course.
the U6 unemployment rate, which is unemployment plus workers who are marginally attached to the labor market or working part-time for economic reasons would rather work full-time. So it's a broader measure of labor underutilization. I used to always look at that stat in the Great Recession time period because we had so much labor market underutilization in that time period. And then as we had such a rapid recovery in hot labor market, it wasn't as relevant. I looked mostly at that main unemployment level. And now we're going back to that sort of, we need to understand labor market underutilization. And so it is 7.1% in December. It's been around 7% for the past few months. That is where it was pre-pandemic. But 1 year ago, it was 6.5%. So that 0.6 percentage point increase in underutilization is still a pretty remarkable increase. It means we were using more of our workers in last year than we are right now. So that's one stat I'm following pretty closely. On the more positive side, I'm looking at a lot of care sector jobs, the public sector jobs, and construction jobs. I think these are three industries I always look at pretty closely for a few different reasons about what they tell us about the health of the labor market. For the construction jobs, that they've continued to grow, they're higher than they were pre-pandemic, which is really remarkable because that industry tends to be very sensitive to interest rates, but it's continuing to grow. And so pretty heartened to see that industry continues to grow. Public sector work, likewise, is continuing to increase, particularly government and state government positions, pretty equally split between local education and other local government positions. And I think these are pretty critical jobs because these are the jobs that create short-term and long-term economic growth. They're educating our future workforce. They're making sure people have access to the social services they need in order to fully participate in the economy and have a stable foundation to do so. So that public sector work is really great. And then those care sector jobs, so healthcare, social assistance, those jobs continue to grow. They've grown over the long term in the economy, but I think they're really critical to having a healthy economy because if people aren't cared for, they can't participate fully in the economy. And so I like to see growth in those three industries. I think I actually just gave you 4 or 5 stats, but those are things I look at mostly.
Isn't that always the way with economists? I'm going to show you 30 slides in 15 minutes, and I'm going to give you 4 stats for one. That's all right, because I'm going to riff off of some of what both of you said. So it seems like, we've got some optimism on Harry's part of, folks without a high school degree seeing a better unemployment rate this month. Kate, you seem like you're seeing some optimism in certain sectors, but you're worried about that U6 number. I land right smack in the middle of this with you guys, where I was also looking at the unemployment rate for workers without a high school degree. And what I had focused on was we're not doing as well as we did last year, right? So December 2023, we're at 6%. December 2022, we were at 5%, right? So a little of what you were saying, Kate, that we're not using that part of the labor force as effectively as we had been a year ago. And similarly, for me, I always keep an eye on the unemployment rate for teens, right? So even though it's not summertime and it's not summer jobs, teenagers do still work during the school year. And so for teens age 16 to 19, again, we're down 1.9 percentage points compared to where we were last December. So, teens are usually the last to be hired, first to be fired. And this has been a consistent theme coming off of the summer, where it looks like maybe not as many teenagers were able to hold on to their summer job or were asked to continue on or were able to move to the next job during the school year. So that's always a a canary in the coal mine for me about what might be happening in terms of the labor market cooling. And then, as you said, the U6 edging up and being higher compared to last year. I do worry about the number of persons not in the labor force. So that's up by about 500,000 over the year. So these are individuals who, were not counted in the official unemployment rate because they weren't actively looking for work during the last 4 weeks, but are folks who would like to have a job. And then even among those who are employed, the number of persons employed part-time for economic reasons, so folks who want a full-time job but only have a part-time job, that's also up by about 330,000 over the year. So that's another kind of softening piece where not everybody is able to participate in this labor market as fully as they would like, which maybe harkens back to Harry's original concern about the labor force participation rate. So I think the upside, though, is that the number of discouraged workers in that U6, that has actually stayed stable over the last year or so. So that means these workers haven't given up entirely, but it is getting harder for them to find a way into the labor market. So I think, in terms of what workforce development people like to look at, a strong labor market is a terrible thing to waste. And it's always a great opportunity to employ the most vulnerable. And it feels like that window maybe is closing. Okay, so I'm going to ask you guys a little bit about your long-term view, right? So what do you see coming down the pike for 2024? How did workers do in terms of gaining or losing power in 2023? And where do you think we're going to end up? So Kate, I'm going to start with your take. Have workers been gaining or losing power over the last year? And where do you think we'll be landing over the next 12 months?
Sure. I'm going to hearken to a little bit of what you had talked about with union gains. And so I think historically, we know that a strong and healthy labor market is where unions are able to make the biggest gains because it's much easier to demand the value that you create in the economy when there's a lot of value being created currently in the economy. And I think we saw some of that in the past year, and it was really exciting to see. So particularly some of those big contracts like the Teamsters contract with UPS, we saw that with the UAW contract with the big three. We saw that with the Hollywood strikes leading to really good contracts. And those were all, remarkable wins in the labor movement. That being said, there's still, because we lack the institutional supports, because we lack the policies that would really help more workers to organize and bake in these gains for non-unionized workers as well. I don't know how those gains might be somewhat limited. And so I'm thinking of only one Amazon warehouse has been able to collectively bargain, or the hundreds of Starbucks stores that have voted for a union, but not a single contract. And particularly, we're seeing a sclerotic National Labor Relations Board that isn't able to keep up with the times of how organizing needs to happen when workers want a union in their workplace. And so Starbucks, I know, is asking for in-person bargaining, which is just very difficult to do for these group of workers. It requires travel time, it requires time off that they can't do. And so they are, what I would say is, they're taking advantage of NLRB current rules to try to forestall actual contracts. And so I think, and likewise, we know that NLRB fines and fees are too low, that there's no incentive to comply with them, as we found from research from Anna Stansberry. And so I think without those policy changes, it's going to be somewhat limited what gains we can make. And another factor too is, the policy changes between states. And so a number of states and cities and counties just increased their minimum wage on January 1st. I forget the exact number, but it was something like 40 something states, cities, counties, states increased their minimum wage. While the wage growth we saw in the pandemic was a result of these market forces, minimum wage is another important source for wage gains for low-wage workers. And we're going to see this regional divergence without a higher federal minimum wage. And so, it's great that those workers in those places are seeing a higher minimum wage. It's helping those wage gains that they're able to make now get a little more baked in for the long term. But what about workers who aren't in states and places that are raising their minimum wage? I think those places are going to fall behind as the market starts to cool, and we'll have more regional divergence. And so, we need to leverage the moment. And I think you'd said something about that similar earlier, that we need to leverage the moment to make those big policy changes and changes to our institutions, because otherwise I think we're going to go back to that really highly unequal labor market. And I think that unequal labor market is one where we're not using our labor to the best of its ability. We're not supporting consumers' ability to spend in the economy if the consumers who spend more of their incomes are making less income. And so I think, with all those big changes, I'm a little bit concerned about the long-term prospect.
Yeah, and we're heading into an election year where there's probably not going to be a lot of movement legislatively, I would think, on these kinds of issues. But I don't know. I'm going to turn to Harry. Harry, you get the final word before I get the final word. So have workers
Next, the
been
final word.
losing? Yeah, gaining, losing. Like, what do you see?
So I think wage gains by workers depends both on market
Mm,
forces and institutional forces. And Kate did a very nice job of really covering all the institutional forces. So I'll focus more on the market forces. And there's one other number, not in this report, but in other reports, that I think has been very encouraging, and that's productivity growth. Productivity growth in the last 2 quarters has actually been very high. It's actually been over 4% on an annualized basis. Now, productivity is another number that has really bounced around a lot since the pandemic started, because you had such massive swings in the numbers of people working, and output didn't always keep up with those numbers. A lot of economists say, well, the trend for productivity right now is 1.5%. And if trend is 1.5, if workers have over 4% wage growth, that looks a little bit inflationary. I'm a little more bullish on productivity. I think the numbers of the last few years suggest we're getting up more in the 2% range. And if you get 2% productivity and you have 4% wage growth, you're at 2% inflation, you're at the Fed's target. There's no need for them to tighten. And my view is that productivity growth does not always translate into higher wages for workers. And too little of the productivity growth over the last 40 years ended up in workers' paychecks. Too much of it ended up in the very top of the workforce or in profits. The combination of a tight labor market and high productivity growth is a great combination, because then the tight labor market gives workers the bargaining power that they need to demand their slice of that productivity growth. So I think we have seen that this year in wage growth over the year of about 4%, maybe a little higher. And I'm hopeful that that continues. Good productivity. Plus, if we get the soft landing and the labor market maintains its current level of tightness, that would be a really good combination for workers. And then I would expect they could see real wage growth above inflation in a way that doesn't make up for all the problems in the market, but certainly moves us in the right direction.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I think for me right now, worker power is coming down to show me the money, right? And so I think, again, even with the job market having this unevenness, we also see unevenness in the inflation numbers, right? So even though we have this, CPI official estimate of around 3%, it goes up to 4% when you do core CPI, excluding food and energy prices. And it feels like workers are getting ahead. There's other parts of that spending basket where inflation is higher, right? And I think one of the things that I'm most concerned with is the shelter index, right? So the shelter index in November, the inflation rate there was 6.5%. And I did look back because I was like, oh, well, maybe this is in hotels and travel. But actually, in November, it was rent, owner's equivalent rent, that was up in terms of inflation in November in that shelter index. Other things that were up in November above the overall inflation index was medical care and car insurance, right? So these feel like essential things in people's market baskets that makes me worry a little bit that workers haven't gotten enough of a wage increase to be able to offset some of these inflationary prices that they're experiencing out in the world. And so I was glad that when you did like that 3-month calculation, the annualization of what we're seeing now, that maybe their wages are getting a little bit more ahead of what they have been. I'm okay with that. We'll have to see if the Fed's okay with it. And then I guess the last thing is that we also have to remember this, any rate of increase in prices right now is on top of all the prior increases, right? So the price levels for these things are still up significantly compared to pre-pandemic, and which again, just makes workers and consumers probably less optimistic than us economists. So not to leave us on a downturn there, but hopefully this wage growth is strong and it continues, and hopefully the Fed doesn't feel like that's a reason to slow down their plans to ease up on the brakes here. So I am going to wrap it up there for today. We're at time. I want to thank today's guests, Kate and Harry, for their expert insights and their continued excellent work. It's always great to see you guys. I also want to thank Asia Sims, our producer. And before you go, audience, please do subscribe to the Power at Work blog. Seth Harris would be very cross with me if I didn't remind you of that. So you can keep updated on all the great content that we're producing. There's lots of other great podcasts there and other insightful pieces every week. And thanks for watching. We will